A reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Thus says the Lord, this is the fasting that I wish, releasing those bound unjustly, untying the thongs of the yoke, setting free the oppressed, breaking every yoke, sharing your bread with the hungry, sheltering the oppressed and the homeless, clothing the naked when you see them, and not turning your back on your own. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your wound shall quickly be healed. Your vindication shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove from your midst oppression, false accusation, and malicious speech, if you bestow your bread on the hungry and satisfy the afflicted, then light shall rise for you in the darkness, and the gloom shall become for you like midday. Then the Lord will guide you always and give you plenty, even on the parched land. He will renew your strength, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring whose water never fails. Verbum Domini.
Deo gratias.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commands. His posterity shall be mighty upon the earth. The upright generation shall be blessed.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
Wealth and riches shall be in his house. His generosity shall endure forever. Light shines through the darkness for the upright. He is gracious and merciful and just.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
Well for the man who is gracious and lends, who conducts his affairs with justice. He shall never be moved. The just one shall be in everlasting remembrance.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
An evil report he shall not fear. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. His heart is steadfast. He shall not fear, till he looks down upon his foes.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
Lavishly he gives to the poor. His generosity shall endure forever. His horn shall be exalted in glory.
Blessed the man who fears the Lord.
One Father in heaven, you have but one Master, the Christ.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Dominus vobiscum. Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Matteum.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. Verbum Domini. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments: love God and love neighbor. These are the two pillars of all the commandments. They summarize them for us. And we see that in the life of the saint today, Saint King Louis IX of France, that had this great position of power and authority as a king, but would also use that very much to serve the people, to benefit the people, the country in a very just way. He lived from 1214 to 1270. Famously, he said he would rather die a leper than commit a single mortal sin. Had this great horror of sin in his life and was a very obviously devout religious person. He prayed the office, liturgy, the hours daily. He would invite poor guests to his residence and would wait on them himself. He was a patron of the Third Order of Franciscans and had a heart for the poor. He also would wage war with England at least two occasions, but would seek peaceful resolutions, wherever he could, and try to end the conflicts quickly. He would reform the legal system. They would settle sometimes these disputes with combat, and he sought to have a more a just system than just physical force, in settling disputes. He would establish 3 monasteries. He supported the foundation of the Sorbonne University in Paris. He built Sainte-Chapelle, which supposedly is to be a beautiful chapel there in Paris. And he built it to house some of the relics of the crown of thorns. He would marry and have 11 children and would lead 2 crusades to the Holy Land that didn't end well. His armies were decimated by disease and sickness. And he would try to aid the Christians there in the Holy Land that were being persecuted and overrun, and try to support the protection of the Holy Land sites. And he would die on the Second Crusade after a few years being away from his country in 1270. Today, Jesus commands us to love God with all our heart, quoting from the Old Testament, that we are to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, heart, soul, and mind. That expresses the whole inner reality, our inner being, the inner man, to give totally over to God, that we had to have God first, to place that kingdom first in our life, and to love him with that decision of the will, with all our heart. And that would certainly, although he doesn't say it here explicitly, to include the body. Certainly include, to love God with all our being would include our body, that it matters what we do in the body. Our relationship with God is not just the interior dimension. I have some fundamental attitude towards God, and I can do whatever I want in my life, outside of that in a physical sense. But we have this interior disposition and live it out physically in our life, and that living it out expresses the inner reality of loving God. That just makes sense. It's common sense. But we actually hear the contrary today, that we can somehow say, well, I still love God, but all this other stuff going on in my life doesn't really matter. All what matters is, what's in my heart. And once there is some truth to that is so important, that interior orienting to God, but it always has to be seeking to bring in alignment, what we're doing with our life, how we're living. So it's a decision that's followed by action, that must be fully lived in our life. So we are called to keep his commandments. And today's answering the question of the greatest. And he chooses these two, as I said, because it's a summary of the whole law, that keeping these commandments entails, obviously, rejecting sin in all its forms. As he would say in different ways, King St. Louis, in different ways, this horror of sin, this desire to live his life in harmony with God's law, that to keep the commandments obviously entails rejecting sin. So we are to, in loving God, to seek him in prayer and worship, and this requires effort, to come to church, to receive the sacraments, to have a disciplined daily prayer life, that we spend time in loving converse with God. We practice traditional forms of piety that the church in her wisdom and treasury passes down to us, ways to live out this communion with God. And what I love to say about the rosary, that we can say that prayer when we're tired, when we're distracted, and it gives us a way to form our hearts. It gives us a path to live out that devotion in such a beautiful way. And there's a multitude of different practices we can have in our prayer life. So the practice of our religion, and again, religion oftentimes gets a bad rap. We say we're spiritual, not religious, that somehow religion de facto is looked upon as hypocrisy or not important, to put ourselves through the motions of devotion. This practice of religion helps us to orient the entirety of our lives to God. That, left to my own devices and my own selfishness, my own self-centeredness, I find excuses to break the moral law, not to come to church, not to give that precious time to God that I need to. Our religion gives us a way to be practical and to bring ourselves back to the Lord in a very concrete way. I think it's kind of naive to think that I'm just going to do this on my own and just rely on my own discipline. Right? I need instruction. I need the witness of others. I need to be reminded of the faith, not just from myself, but from the witness of others, of the saints in their lives, of the teachings of the church. So in the practice of our religion, we encounter him in the liturgy, in the word that's proclaimed and read and meditated on in the Mass. And so we encounter him in the word and the sacraments. That we're instructed by his word how we are to live, and we encounter Jesus in that living word. And also, obviously, we encounter him in the sacraments, in the Eucharist, where he is there in the most extraordinary way, body, blood, soul, and divinity of the Eucharist. And receiving these sacraments, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, that we are transformed. We are brought into communion with him to live out his teaching, to live this word that he gives us, to live out these commandments. I can't do it of my own will, unaided will, of my own determination. I need to be transformed by his grace. I need to be strengthened by his grace to live that word. So we're transformed by the sacraments to live in friendship with God. And when we violate the commandments, committing sin, we destroy that friendship. But thankfully, there's the sacrament of reconciliation. We can confess our sins and be restored to grace and to begin again in living in friendship with God. So the commandments are a path to friendship. They're not in themselves the end of religion or the end of our relationship with God, but it's a path that we can walk in peace. When we commit sin, we become attached to disorder and sin, make an idol of that. We're clinging to that stuff rather than God. So these commandments show us a way to walk hand in hand in friendship with God. And this friendship, which we grow in throughout our lives and in our spiritual life, leads us to seek his will. And that's That's no small thing, right? To be really surrendered to God's will, to seek His will, that's something I think we always need to be converted to and return to, because we hit challenges, maybe struggle with sin, maybe with attachments in our life that distract us from His will, that bring us along another path. So we have to be removing the obstacles and attachments to sin, to disorders, by God's grace. And seeking His will, I recently was reading a spiritual book about an expression of having goodwill. It means to have this disposition, this desire to seek His will. And that is no small thing. This book related a story about how a priest was was a saint actually, performing an exorcist, and the demon exclaimed, he said, this confounded goodwill in people. He said, there's nothing I can do to overcome that. When a person has that goodwill, that desire to seek God's will and to do it, that defeats the devil himself. That we can have lots of faults and weaknesses and brokenness and things in our life that we just can't even explain why we do whatever it is we do. But if we have that interior disposition to seek His will, to get up again when we have fallen, to set out again, to follow God, to live His law, that's a great thing. And I've seen that, and other people have been edified, that lots of brokenness going on, lots of failure, lots of mistakes and mess-ups, but they have this beautiful desire fundamentally to do His will. And I'm not talking about that general orientation I mentioned before, and a vague notion of, I believe in God, but to have this real kind of interior heart for God, that I want to please Him. I want to seek Him. I'm trying to surrender to Him, and that is a great thing. We call it, maybe another word for it, we say of goodwill, we say that in the Gloria on Sundays and feast days, but also to have purity of heart, purity of intention, of wanting God, that, this can coexist with hesitations, imperfections, faults, as I mentioned, but we are determined to say yes to God in the great things as in the small, to keep trying to surrender to Him. And God works with that in our life. He'll do something great in our life with that. We don't give up on that. We keep seeking Him. And I think that's at the heart of this loving God and loving neighbor, because the Lord will bring us along. He'll give us grace. He'll strengthen us. And maybe it's a path that we have to be humbled. We have to find a new surrender to Him. But He will do something beautiful with our life.